I am Dr. Kelli Morgan. I'm a critical race cultural historian. So my work really champions African American art. Hey everybody, Dr. Morgan back at you here today to talk to you about Romare Bearden, and particularly how he uses jazz as a visual framework in his Prevalence of Ritual portfolio. So, first and foremost, Bearden was born in Charlotte, North Carolina, Mecklenburg County to be exact. Raised primarily in New York, spent a lot of time in Pittsburgh, with his maternal grandmother, studied at the Art Student League, Columbia University, as well as the Sorbonne, in Paris. So Bearden had this fascinating, multifaceted, and, fabulous career. He worked as a cartoonist, early in his artistic career, as well as working in modernist styles. Later on in his career, he started out in social realism. He wrote music, he wrote art history, he worked as a social worker, from the mid 30s, I think through the 60s, before his, art career or career as a professional artist really took off. And in that time, he really existed. He was really the fulcrum, to a very deep and wide community, of Black people, Black intellects, political leaders, jazz artists, performers, writers, you name it, and across cities, right? So this wasn't just something that was unique, right, to Harlem. It was an entire network, of people, between, Harlem, Paris, DC, Chicago, Detroit, Pittsburgh, Philly, Atlanta. They moved, and shook, around the world. And what was growing out, of that community, and even I would say, 30, 40 years before, right, Bearden's lifetime was jazz, and jazz was an uniquely American, specifically Black, and specifically modern sonic expression that influenced the world, right? So when we talk about Bearden, and even a lot of his contemporaries, right, and their usage and innovation, in modernist aesthetics or modernist frameworks, and even the ways in which they study with a lot of the European, masters, modern masters, those European modernists, guess where they were pulling inspiration from? African design and African American jazz, and to come up, to come of age during the time that Bearden did, he knew jazz inside and out, well before, he knew American modernism or European modernism, right? And I think so for me as a Black curator and as a Black woman, it's always important to me to kind of reshape that narrative, that visual modernist aesthetics, didn't happen for Bearden first, right? And a lot of his contemporaries, right? Jazz did. And even to just kind of change that narrative, around jazz as well, and so I wanted to really get into, how jazz shows up, as a visual framework for Bearden in these works. So I think one of the first ways that jazz shows up most prevalently or prominently in Bearden's work is through improvisation and syncopation, specifically in the ways that collage really exists as a visual representation of both concepts. And Bearden was a master at it. Collage being his signature style, he uses improvisation and syncopation throughout his work. And in the images that you see here, these are the original 4 collages titled The Prevalence of Ritual. These are the 4 pieces that the portfolio that I'll be talking about a little later in the video actually are extensions of. But you see improvisation here and syncopation here in the way that he uses the hands, for instance, in this piece, where you can see a white hand attached to a black body. And it's about the handness, as he would say, not necessarily the race, right? So he's using these disparate parts, to represent a universal theme of humanity. You see the syncopation in the way in which you have these disparate parts all working together to form one image, right? When we think about syncopation in jazz or in music in general, right, it is various instruments playing particular parts and those parts coming together to make a whole. Bearden does this most succinctly in his collages because you can see that there are disparate parts coming together to make an entire visual composition. Another important jazz element that is consistent in Bearden's work is the riff, the short repeated phrase that is often thought of as the refrain in a song. For this body of work, the title itself, The Prevalence of Ritual, would be that riff, as well as it being the title of all of the previous collages and this suite of prints. It was also the title of his 1971 show at MoMA. That I have to add in this moment was even put on at MoMA due to the fervent protest that Bearden, Norman Lewis, Benny Andrews, Richard Mayhew, and scores of other African-American artists living in New York and on the East Coast at the time put up against the New York institutions because of what? Let's think about it. The lack of equity, that continues to exist in all of these institutions. The riff also appears stylistically in Bearden's work, and we can see that here in the print Prevalence of Ritual, John the Baptist, in the ways that the figure's faces, as well as John the Baptist's face in Salome's hands here, very much so mimics the design and the style of African mask that appear on the figures here in the collage Prevalence of Ritual, Baptism. The chorus, or main theme, shows up in the Prevalence of Ritual in the fact that the work is very much so about Black people and Black life. Bearden says, quote, "It is not my aim to paint about the Negro in America in terms of propaganda, but the life of my people as I know it, passionately and dispassionately as Bruegel. My intention is to reveal through pictorial complexities the life that I know." And finally, Bearden communicates that life very eloquently through the bridge, or what can be called connecting secondary themes, which for this suite of prints and collages would be biblical subject matter. So you see Eve in the garden, but not as a sensuous temptress. She's a medicine woman or conjure woman. She's a Black woman working in her garden in ways to help her family and her community and those who come to her for healing, for spiritual advice, for love potions even. You have Mary being visited by the angel at the Annunciation. And she's a Black woman with a kerchief, not a stereotypical mammy, right? But a Black woman in her home being visited by the presence and messenger of God. And lastly, we have Noah, a Black man presented in profile, which if you look closely, the area around his head could be read as either an afro, because remember these prints were done in 1974, or a halo. And think about, how did the world feel about these young Black revolutionary men with these halo-like afros walking around the country demanding rights, as problematic as they were in their patriarchy, right? But demanding rights for themselves and their communities in the mid to late 70s, right? Not too good, not to say that Bearden was political or revolutionary in that way, right? But in talking about and presenting Black life, through universal stories, that were biblical, right? Christian. It's a way to soften, it's a way to humanize, and it was a way to visualize the reality of the humanity of Black people, period, not just Black men. So in this regard, Bearden is visualizing a Black man that is heading the vessel that is giving life back to the earth. These are not incidental or accidental, themes and connections and ways. These are very deliberate connections, and very deliberate stories that Bearden is telling. Through one, Black people and Black figures and Black culture, and two, through jazz, the Blackest modernist framework of the 20th century.